of the conference. Don't forget plenary at 5 o'clock, from 5 to 6, which is going to be remarkable in the big room. And from 8 to 10, the awards reception. I'm not sure if we're sold out or not, we might be, but both of those will be remarkable events, bring everybody back together. But this session, this roundtable, what's next with marijuana? And we have, oh damn, 6 guys again. I will explain, every panel is planned not to be that way. So typically what it means is that there are some other people we want to get canceled or whatever. So I just apologize for this kind of shit yesterday. Anyway, but fortunately 6 remarkable experts. So let me just say, starting off from Pete Holmes on the right, who's been the city attorney of Seattle, who's actually up for re-election, but nobody's going to run against him because he's done such a one of the outstanding people in that kind of position. City attorney's like a DA and the other civil part of the attorney mixed together. So just incredible. Neil Franklin, you all know, the head of legal. Rob Campia, heading marijuana policy project, just playing a pivotal role all around the country. Legislation ballot, as you know it. Rob, thank you. Rob McCune, professor at Berkeley, somebody who has also been associated with RAND Corporation, doing really innovative research, not just about marijuana policy, but drug policy. His book, co-authored Drug War Heresies with Peter Reuter, is maybe the best book on comparative drug policy ever written, and just done a lot of great work and good questions off from here. Rob, thanks for being here. And Zeke Edwards, the ACLU's Criminal Justice Reform Project, who did this remarkable report with a few of his colleagues on racial bias in marijuana arrests that really lit up the front pages. I mean, took the work that Harry Levine was doing in New York and a few places and nationalized that work. So I'm very happy you're here. And Graham Boyd, who founded and built up the ACLU's Drug Law Reform Project, doing incredible work in a whole variety of areas, and now is in the new role for the last few years as the key advisor and counselor to Peter Lewis, and therefore playing a role which is about as important as can be nationally and even internationally on marijuana law reform, more behind the scenes, but having a role of immense influence. So Graham, I'm really glad. So let me start by saying this. Gallup polls show 58%. Public and private polls are showing incredible support. You know, we used to say, if you're not up around 58%, don't bother doing a ballot initiative. Although Washington, Colorado taught us that actually, in fact, you can do that. And Rob Campia did tons of work that beforehand as well. Well, Rob McCune, you think that some of this stuff actually might be a little more vulnerable and that we should be careful not getting too confident about this stuff. So say a little something about that.
Yeah, my job is to bum you all out. Well, I mean, the change in public opinion has been remarkable, and I think it's real. One note of caution. So in 1980, between 1980 and 1990, baby boomer support for legalized marijuana dropped in half. Dropped from about 42% to actually under 20%. And so what comes up can go down, and there's, you know, I think there's some risk that the same thing that could happen now. I would speculate, you know, what happened between 1980 and 1990. 1979 was the peak year for marijuana use in terms of number of users, and so it might have been a reaction to that. It may be that the baby boomers all became young parents around that time. There are a lot of baby boomers who were parents, and their opinions have rebounded now that their kids are older. I don't know, but I just a note of caution that it's not sort of it's inexorable historical determinism that public opinion will always move in an upward direction here.
Anybody else want to comment on Rob's thoughts about that?
I actually agree with that. I mean, with regard to the public opinion polling recently, I mean, I'm happier than a slinky on an escalator. But these numbers do go up, they do go down. And in the 1970s, people said marijuana legalization is just around the corner. We heard this from a whole bunch of people And then it wasn't around the corner when Nancy Reagan got elected president. So that didn't really work out very well. You also see other social movements where the support for abolishing the death penalty was quite high in the 70s, and then it dropped after that. We can probably talk about other social issues. I think the main thing that we need to do is that in our movement is to manage expectations. Because if we're all walking around thinking that legalization is inevitable, then that's a recipe for disaster. Not only does that mean that we might not even get the funding to do legalization in certain states, but it also might mean that we get sloppy with our drafting. And so I think we want to manage our own expectations. And I think the number for legalization nationwide really is nearly 58. I'd say it's probably in the mid-50s. That's reason to be optimistic, but we still have a ways to go.
I agree with everything that Rob just said, and want to add to it a bit more. The support for legalization, or really for taxation, regulation, and legalization, has increased by about 10% in the last 12 months in multiple states and to a similar degree nationally. I can't think of any other social issue that has moved that far, that quickly, in the space of 1 year. And so thinking about why that could be true, you know, Nancy Reagan started talking about marijuana is bad, and you could not avoid hearing that day in, day out, all the way up until November 2012. And if you look at the media coverage and just pay attention to what's kind of out in the air right now, that anti-marijuana voice essentially disappeared 11 months ago. And so there's a different atmosphere that we're living in right now, one of the promise of good things to come in Colorado and Washington, and yet the system hasn't been set up, so nothing potentially bad has happened either. A discourse that's one-sided about marijuana. And this 10-point increase, well, where is the 10-point increase? It's actually hugely disproportionately among older people and among moderately conservative people, i.e. people who aren't very familiar with marijuana and who generally don't like it very much. And so if you look at that group of people and the shift of their opinion, it tracks their belief that if you tax, regulate, and legalize marijuana, it will make it harder for children to have access to it, right? That's one of the key messages that we had in Washington and Colorado. That message is actually spontaneously sinking in with the American public in this sort of one-sided conversation. I ask myself, what happens as we move to the 2016 presidential election? There are going to be candidates who want to be president who will differ with other candidates. That's just what they do. So someone is going to start talking about marijuana as being a bad thing, I think that is likely to reemerge. In Washington and Colorado, there will be a regulated system that I think will be successful on many fronts, but a few things are going to go wrong. And there's going to be a traffic accident where somebody dies, maybe a school bus runs off the road, there'll be some disaster that happens. It could happen anywhere, but if it happens in Washington or Colorado, and there's a sort of media, momentum around that, there's vulnerability. So I think what Rob and Rob are saying is exactly right, and I think it's really based on drilling down into where public opinion is and looking at how the political process is going to unfold. So I am excited about the future, but at the same time I have some worries, and I think we do have to manage expectations, and we also have to make sure that in drafting for the next few rounds of legalization, we don't suddenly think, well, we can just get everything we want. Because if we reach too far and fall short, we'll be very disappointed. And so I think we still have to be cautious in the same way we were in Washington and Colorado.
Yeah, I just remembering, following Rob McCoon's point, I think that polling, they used to ask, I think, college freshmen, what you think about legalizing marijuana, and it peaked in 1979 at 51%. And by 1989, 10 years later, it had dropped, I think, to about 18%, right? So if you understand that things can shift. We saw outside the marijuana area, we were doing the ballot initiatives on treatment instead of incarceration, and we went overwhelmingly in California in 2000, and then 9/11 happened. And 9/11, basically fucked with the country's consciousness. I mean, people got very security-minded, power shifted in Washington. So this notion that we have the momentum is inevitable, I always, sometimes, we use the line of DPA, well, legalizing marijuana is just a matter of time. And I said, well, wait a second. Let's not get too cocky, too overconfident. Now, we'll come back to this issue about what all this means for ballot initiative legislation in coming years, but I want to back up on a couple of things. The first one is that, you know, Zeke is going to go to you first. The stickiness of marijuana prohibition. We're looking at the polls going here. You know, we're seeing support. We're seeing more and more legislators coming out. But yet, then you look at marijuana arrests, which are half the drug arrests in the country. They come down a little bit, but I don't even think they've come down 10%. And it looks like the cops just keep doing their things. And all the collateral consequences of a petty marijuana conviction. Now, you did this amazing report. You're looking at this stuff. Do you think that this arrest stuff and all this other stuff is going to be following on a similar line with the ending of marijuana prohibition for the public or not?
Well, I'm glad you asked because, I mean, this shifts it a little bit from marijuana to criminal justice and racial justice work, which is, you know, our project at the ACLU does both. We care a lot about drug law reform. Graham used to direct the project and did an amazing job creating that project. We also care a tremendous amount about racial justice. One of the things that the report found, you know, we found racial disparities in every corner of the country. Small and large, you know, rural and urban, 50% black population, 2% black population, rich counties, poor counties, the racial disparities were staggering. And there were also 8 million arrests, marijuana arrests, between 2001 and 2010. Blacks were 4 times as likely to be arrested, in some states 8 times as likely. And so we found this strange kind of paradigm where you had public policy and marijuana laws and medical marijuana and public polling going in a positive direction, and yet kind of the same old happening in the streets and in black communities. And I think one of my biggest concerns as a racial justice advocate is exactly that. You know, for many of you will know this, but if you look at the history of kind of the criminalization of black communities, obviously you had slavery. And then after that, there's a book called Slavery by Another Name, which is a very worthwhile book to read, which is about the criminalization of Southern blacks after the end of slavery, until World War II, where basically black activity was criminalized, low-level offenses, vagrancy. People were arrested, and then they were put into indentured servitude, essentially, involuntary servitude, forced into coal mines, and that lasted for years. And then we had Jim Crow, and then we had the drug war. And so eventually I think the drug war is going to end. I think marijuana policy is going to go in the right direction. I think legalization is going to take control. I think we're going to see more medical marijuana, and I think that's a beautiful thing. But my question is, what is that going to mean for criminal justice in this country, and what is it going to mean for people of color? Because the same police and the same prosecutors, no offense to the prosecutors and police on the panel, but they enforced slavery, they enforced the criminalization after slavery, they enforced Jim Crow, and they enforced the drug war. So there is a culture change that has to happen that I'm not sure kind of runs parallel with marijuana legalization. Now, we support legalization. We are against prohibition of all drugs. And so we were hoping that the marijuana report would do something where it would bring communities together, racial justice communities, drug law reform communities, for sustainable reform, not just on marijuana, but for police practices, for incarceration. I hope it does that, but my fear is that marijuana policy will march ahead in a positive direction, but nothing is going to change, as nothing really has in so many ways for really 300 years in terms of state control of poor communities and communities of color.
Thank you. You actually jumped ahead to our presentations later, but let me pull back a second and ask you and then also Neil to comment, which is, you know, on this issue of marijuana arrest and on the impact of the reports that first Harry and you guys have done, what I'm curious about is, when you look at the public opinion polls, as best I can tell, sometimes there's not quite, the polls are not sort of big enough to be highly reliable, but then essentially what you tend to see is that whites and blacks are fairly similar on the issue of legalization, and Latinos lagging behind, especially older Latinos. The question is, how much did the reports, this information, start influencing, say, older African Americans or Latinos? I want to see, are you contacting that world and Neil? Because you and I have been out there talking to faith leadership, faith communities, African American leadership. I'm curious about how you're feeling that as well. So.
Well, certainly I'm not in any way going to take credit for starting to move the black community in a certain direction, but I will say that one of the great things about the report, because it had a drug law reform angle and a racial justice angle, is it got a whole variety of support. You know, Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom tweeted about it. I had a Twitter conversation with Russell Simmons the day it came out. The NAACP of South Carolina held a press conference challenging the Charleston Police Department on their arrest policies. Melissa Etheridge wrote a CNN blog on marijuana legalization and medical marijuana. And so we have seen the black community...
Keep going on the NAACP. Other things, because some of the NAACP chapters in the marijuana legalization initiative states were already coming out. Then Jell's provided some leadership on this stuff. But are you seeing more residents in the South or surprising places apart from the North?
Yes, and I also, what I was really thrilled was it got tremendous media coverage, and we thought, well, maybe the coverage was really going to be from a drug law reform angle. And in fact, it was largely from a racial justice angle. And that's what everyone was citing, the statistics. There were over 100 articles in local newspapers calling out their counties and states on the disparity. Black clergy and black congressmen have been coming out citing the report. Our affiliates in Washington, D.C., which is a heavily black community, and in Maryland and Baltimore, heavily black community, have been pushing with legislators there decriminalization bills on the eve or afterwards that the report came out. So we've seen policy changes and leaders like, Russell Simmons has a huge following, 2 million people on Twitter, coming out and citing the report. And so I think it's actually done a great job to kind of show that marijuana legalization is not just about drug rights, even though it is. It's not just about Colorado. It's about the African-American community.
I should say Russell Simmons has been out there for a while on this issue. Rockaway Forum, he's on the honorary board of the Drug Policy Alliance. He's not been great on marijuana, so this is good. But Neil, more broadly.
Look, and this is a great point, and I caution comparing what you're seeing today with this movement today with 1970s and 1979. And the reason being is because it really is, this marijuana issue really is the linchpin to a criminal justice issue, as he was saying. The makeup of the movement today is not just, as you put it, Ethan, those people who like drugs. It involves the people who hate drugs and the people who don't give a damn about drugs. So I wish that Alice Huffman was here, because going back to 2010 with Prop 19, Alice Huffman from the NAACP California State Conference came out. She saw the data that was put before her regarding arrests of blacks in California. And she said it was her duty as the leader of the NAACP in California, it was her duty to support that measure, to start talking about this issue and do what she could. And LEAP did not exist in 1970. Okay? Now, when we found out that Alice Huffman was coming out to support this, that's when we contacted Alice Huffman to give her support, regarding this issue, because we knew she was going to catch it. And she did, from certain black pastors and ministers in California, and so we gave her support. Now, as things move forward, Alice Huffman set up a criminal justice meeting with Ben Jealous and the other state conference leaders up in Chicago in the winter of 2011.
And you all know that Ben Jealous has been the head of the NAACP for many years, stepping down shortly, but who, when he took over the job some years ago, announced that criminal justice reform was going to be a priority of his, and who gets it on the marijuana issue as well.
Now, in that room, as many people know, in the NAACP, the black church makes up a good portion, foundation of the NAACP. And there were many black ministers in that meeting up in Chicago. And from there began this, conversation and the data being shared and so on. And the Samuel Wick Proctor conference eventually came into it. And there's someone else I want to point out. I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot, but Rosemary Lytle from Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, NAACP state conference leader. So these leaders coming out, and then the ACLU report comes out, and that's what we were waiting for. It has this one-stop shop resource for data in every state across this country, and we've been using it very well. And so now people are feeling safe to come out with data, and I'll end with this. Not just the NAACP coming on board now, not just the black church, not just the criminal justice issue, and the Latino community is going to come on board, they are coming on board, but it's a completely different picture today than it was back in the 1970s. And I'm going to tell you right now, yes, we have a lot of work to do. We're going to continue to push as we have. Momentum is important, extremely important. But this is going to happen.
Okay.
There's no doubt about it.
I hear you. Who's here both in his own right, and because we asked him to accept one of the awards on behalf of Allison Holcomb tonight, because she cannot be here, because I think Javier Sicilian and his Caravan for Justice are heading up there. But let me ask you this. First, on the law enforcement side of things, I mean, I still look at, when I look at, people say, who's opposed to marijuana reform? And the first people I think of are the police chiefs, the cops, law enforcement, prosecutors. Not so much the prison guards, right? Because marijuana is mostly sending people to jail, not to state prison in a big way. But what happened in Washington State with the former U.S. attorneys, yourself, a range of others, can you just explain a little more about how and why that happened, and whether or not you think that's actually can happen more quickly around the country as well?
Yes, I do. It's the domino effect, and having sitting prosecutors sign on, bring on a couple of former federal prosecutors, all help to empower others who were already inclined, I think, who couldn't deny the data, but needed to be safer, have a safer space in which they could speak out in public. In fact, I mentioned at the panel yesterday that WASPIC, which is our association of sheriffs and police chiefs, although they published a paper against 502, that was after a motion had been brought to the full body asking for a secret ballot on whether or not to oppose 502 or not. So sometimes you got to give them anonymity, sometimes you have to give them just space and their strength in numbers. It is growing, it's a domino effect.
Do you think, I mean, I don't know about these networks, but here, good chance Oregon will be on the ballot 2014, good chance Alaska will be on the ballot 2014. Are there types of relationships or where law enforcement in those states could be affected by conversations by people who came out of Washington?
You bet. We've been coordinating with Neil. We've been talking about taking this on the road. I know that Allison and others have been talking to other states and trying to explain what happened here, what the rationale was behind it. And, I'm the only elected city attorney in Washington, so I spoke 2 weeks ago to the Washington State Association of Municipal Attorneys. And it was trying to sell to appointed city attorneys why they should encourage their cities not to impose moratoria, not to try to undo 502 by local zoning rules. And there were some really excellent conversations there, because our job was to give fodder, if you will, for the electeds back in their jurisdictions, back in their municipalities, about why this is a smart approach. This is going to help your communities. And if you think you're going to ban marijuana in your town by outlawing 502 licensees, then you missed what's been going on for the last 80 years.
So let me come back at you then. So, one of the things that everybody worries about is how's Washington and Colorado going to roll out? And there are people coming from within our world to worry, you guys didn't allow home grow in there. And what's that going to mean? Are people really going to get busted for a few plants or not? There are people worrying about the thing being so restrictive that we really get rid of some of the black market issues that, and then on the other hand going, are you guys going to be able to really make this thing work? Because a lot of states, the Justice Department said, here's the 8 criteria by which we'll evaluate you in Colorado. You got neighboring states, kind of, I heard Oregon, Idaho, they're stopping people with washing plates because maybe they got weed on them and stuff like that. So you're in this incredibly challenging leadership position. And I'm curious your sense about how this is likely to roll out in the coming years and where the real risks are and why you think this could or not go the right way.
Sure. Well, in Washington State, at least, there are pretty much 2 centers of power. One's Olympia, the state legislature, and the other is Seattle. What is Seattle, the state's largest city, going to do? Local zoning is still very much in play under 502, and although individual counties don't have the option, as we did under our liquor laws, to be a dry county, there are none, but they do have the option to be a dry county. Cities and municipalities are really pushing the envelope right now about ending alcohols. So before, you may have heard that the Liquor Control Board a little over a week ago recommended that the state legislature abolish home grows. Home grows are permitted under our existing medical marijuana law, but as confusing as it is. 502 didn't touch medical marijuana. It's whatever the law is what the law will be after 502 passes. So the legislature now has an opportunity. The Liquor Control Board recommended that in order to have a really strictly controlled 502 regulatory system that's not undercut by the underground market, that they eliminate home grows. And the idea behind that is to give clear certainty to law enforcement and give them buy-in that anything that doesn't have a 502 license is fair game for enforcement action. And in fact, you're actually helping your state and you're helping the industry by enforcing it. Now, I personally believe that complete elimination is unnecessary. And what the city of Seattle did before this recommendation came out was to enact a policy, a zoning ordinance that set the maximum for a collective garden under our medical marijuana law at 45 plants. All across the state, medical marijuana growers have been indulging in a fiction that you can have hundreds and hundreds of plants by having collectives of collective gardens. And so the law has been pretty farcical. But to totally eliminate them, I think probably goes too far. I think we can give law enforcement what they need, as the city of Seattle has said. We don't care what you do with medical marijuana, but if you don't touch it, in the city of Seattle, you either have to be 45 plants or fewer with a medical authorization or have a 502 license.
And the risk is the fear of leakage from the medical marijuana system, and that you'll get exports from Washington to other states coming out of the unlicensed system, the medical marijuana one. I mean, is that basically trying to? Because I had Steph Shear, the head of ASA, who's going to receive one of the awards tonight, and she was talking to me, Ethan, like, where's medical marijuana fitting in this place? Are we going to need another track that specifically aims to protect medical marijuana against some of the overly tight constrictions? So, any thoughts about that?
Well, it's the conundrum is that most Americans talk about polling have never bought the idea that marijuana has no valid medical uses. That Schedule 1 is also a fiction. At the same time, they also believe that where states have allowed medical marijuana, as in Washington, that it's heavily abused by recreational users. Anyone can guess what it is, 90%, 95%. And consequently, trying to reconcile those two problems, that yes, we should absolutely have medical marijuana, and that recreational use is really what's driving the discomfort people have in their communities. That's why 502 said, let's just be honest about it. Let's have an honest conversation. Prohibition has failed. There are valid uses for marijuana. And now let's move forward. Let's say we're going to legalize, regulate, and tax recreational. Now, how fast, I think the Cole memo had a lot to do, the August 29 Cole memo had a lot to do with Seattle's ordinance coming out. And it also has a lot to do with how quickly we're going to be able to ramp up. The Liquor Control Board estimated that in the first year of operation, only about 25% of that recreational demand would be met by the 502 stores, because people would continue to go to their quote-unquote medical producer. And with the Cole memo and its emphasis on strict controls, I think that it's going to ramp up. I wrote to the Liquor Control Board and said that the 21 stores allotted to Seattle were going to be insufficient, which led to some fun blogging when the city attorney says Seattle needs more pot shops.
I loved watching that Senate hearing that Senator Leahy did last month with White House there and a few other senators. And they had, I think, the sheriff from King County, Seattle, where Seattle is.
Yes.
And a big discussion about what we're going to do about the banking problem. Now, what's the banking problem? The fact that under the current system, banks don't want to have any customers that have anything to do with marijuana business because they're illegal under federal law. So you actually had members of the U.S. Senate saying, can't we resolve this thing? And you had the Justice Department, right, basically saying, our criteria that we've laid out, actually, we don't want all these people in the marijuana industry carrying large chunks of cash. Any of you have a sense of how this banking issue is going to play out? When we see quick progress, I mean, Graham, Rob, or Pete? Anyone want to take that one?
I'll just say, you know, I've been studying this issue for some time, but I didn't really appreciate that banks weren't taking the medical marijuana business until recently, when I was in Seattle meeting with at some dispensaries, and you know, this is a serious problem. You cannot operate businesses with that much cash on hand. It is just asking for trouble, and this issue does have to be resolved. And I don't know if it's going to be setting up their own banking system. I think what has to happen is the feds have to create a comfort zone for the banks.
Well, you figure just when we see the hypocrisy in saying we want to reduce criminal involvement, et cetera, and then try to trip them up. Right? Any thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Senate hearing, because in my estimation, there have only been 5 hearings in Congress on marijuana policy since I moved to DC 20 years ago. And the first 4 hearings went very badly for our movement. Very badly. I testified at 2 of them, and it was, they were unhelpful for moving our ball forward down the field. But the 5th one, Senate Judiciary Committee, was a wonderful hearing because the majority of the senators in attendance were supportive, the majority of the witnesses were supportive, and the Deputy Attorney General went out of his way to say that they actually support marijuana being regulated in Colorado and Washington, because otherwise if it's not regulated, then it's a free-for-all. And so he essentially said that taxing and regulating like alcohol or something like that is preferable to not doing that. So that was a huge step forward. So we have lots of reasons to be encouraged on the federal level. The Senate Judiciary Committee is looking better. The Justice Department, with their 3rd of 3 memos, 2009, the memo was good. 2011, the memo was bad. 2013, the memo was almost as good as we could have hoped for. And now it shifts to the banking issue. Unlike the tax issue, where people who are running marijuana businesses are not able to get the same tax deductions as if you're running a bagel shop or other kinds of businesses, the tax issue has to be solved through statute. It has to be solved through Congress. The banking issue, our understanding is that it could actually be solved through the Treasury Department. And it could actually be, and maybe Graham would correct me on this, but last I heard is it doesn't require an act of Congress, but rather banks are craving some comfort from the Treasury Department. If they get some wonderful memo that says you are protected, then the banks can go forward and do what they used to do, which is to do regular business transactions with marijuana businesses.
I think this is one of the biggest deals that has happened on the federal level is what the Deputy Attorney General said on banking. And this is why. Everything that we've been struggling over with the Department of Justice has been about criminal enforcement and with medical marijuana, asking the Department of Justice to not enforce criminal laws. But in other words, basically back off, right? Stay out of this. Let's let the state deal with it. And as Rob says, you know, that kind of, it started off kind of good, and then it got worse, and, you know, there's some up and down with it. But the question has always been, will the federal government back off and not, you know, mess up what a state is trying to do? This is the first time in which a federal official has signaled that the federal government is actually going to step forward. Because it's not enough for the federal government to simply say, we will not make a priority of targeting banks that provide banking services to dispensaries, right? That wouldn't do the trick. Because if you're a dispensary operator, it might be enough to say we're not going to prioritize you, right? Because you would say, okay, it's a little scary, but I'm willing to risk it. If you're a bank, you're not willing to risk anything. So in order for the banking issue to be fixed, the federal government actually has to affirmatively enter into this, has to change the rules, has to create a set of rules that make sense. I was shocked. I mean, my jaw was on the floor when Jim Cole said that he was going to take care of this. First of all, I don't think it's clear that there's statutory authority.
And although Jim Cole is the Deputy Attorney General who drafted this memo, the Justice Department memorandum, they gave Colorado and Washington a qualified green light to move forward.
Right. So delighted that he said we're going to back off and let the states implement. But when he said we're going to get involved in fixing the banking issue, it's not clear to me that there's a statutory authority to do that. It's very clear to me that the entity that has to fix it is not the Department of Justice. So you've got the prosecutor, the second highest prosecutor in the federal government, saying we're going to convene the Department of Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the Comptroller of the Currency. We're going to bring all these people in and fix this. So what actually happened in that little 2-minute exchange in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee was the federal government suddenly committed itself, for the first time ever, to starting to actually regulate marijuana instead of criminalizing it. Apparently there are discussions at TSA. Yeah, but that is what's not anymore. It really is a TSA is also engaging in a similar process of figuring out how to change their rules to deal with Washington and Colorado. So I think there's this thing happening a little bit below the ground level in Washington, D.C., where they suddenly are starting to get it. So I think it's huge. And at the same time, the policy folks who aren't in government, I mean, you've got Brookings now engaging this. You've got, I went to a meeting with another think tank that we're sort of developing a relationship with. And one of the people there who has a deep experience with banking law said, I think what we need to do is set up a association that's funded by the marijuana industry that will self-regulate in the financial services industry. It was like, spinning out this idea. I was like, I don't have any idea what you're talking about, but awesome. This is amazing. So it's really exciting stuff.
It's remarkable how much that actually, what they're talking about, sounds like what New Zealand was talking about, right? In terms of taking a gray market industry on recreational, the alphabetamoines and looking whether some of these can be approved and working hand in hand with industry. See?
I just wanted to add, going back to Rob's point, also another significant moment during that hearing with James Cole, it deals with a little bit with the issue of preemption and whether federal law trumps state law, and when it comes to the legalization or decriminalization of marijuana. The ACLU has been litigating that issue for many years now, and we're currently litigating it in Arizona, where we're defending the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act from attempts in state court to find it void under federal law. But one of the arguments we've been making of late is not just that the 10th Amendment allows states to decriminalize, to remove criminal penalties, but and not only does it not stand as an obstacle to the objectives of Congress when it passed the Controlled Substances Act, but it actually furthers the objectives of Congress, because Congress envisioned a world where there'd be federal regulation and there'd be state regulation. And so when a state decides that it's going to regulate, it may remove criminal penalties, and then it's going to regulate legalization, that actually furthers the objectives of Congress. We've gotten a couple of judges to agree with us. But essentially, James Cole said the same thing, because he said, we are emphasizing comprehensive regulation and well-funded state enforcement, because such a system will complement the continued enforcement of state drug laws by state and local enforcement officials in a manner that should allay the threat to federal enforcement interests. Indeed, a robust system may affirmatively address those federal priorities. So again, along these lines, we're essentially saying that if you regulate, that's kind of furthering our objective of regulation, which is what we've been trying to argue in court in our preemption cases.
Let me, I want to jump into one of the more controversial issues among many of those activists in a moment, but I think I want to throw a question to Rob McCoon, because one of the big question marks is what happens to marijuana use among both adolescents and older people with legalization. And Rob and Peter Royer wrote an important book basically saying that by and large rates of drug use don't go up and down independent of changes in law, especially decriminalization. Now we have the question of legalization, the possibilities of marketing, the question of whether that hits younger people or older, changes in consumption with vaporization and vaporizers and how that will change things. Rob, what's your kind of best thoughts about what's likely to happen?
Yeah, so, we actually did what are called Monte Carlo computer simulations for California, and we came up with a huge range of estimates, which shows that we really don't know. We said, we examined a whole bunch of assumptions and said, it could, under none of our scenarios would marijuana use go down. But the amount of increase in, here I'm talking about what prevalence, number of users rather than the amount consumed. So in terms of prevalence, the increase could be 100% increase, which sounds like a lot, but in fact that's still within historical experience. That would bring us to about 1979 levels of use, and we know what that means. Those of us who are old enough, we've lived through that. I don't remember any of it. I don't remember any of it, but I know I was there. I have the yearbook. But the high-end estimates that we got were the really significant use were driven by assumptions about price. Now, I'm a social psychologist, but I have to say, price really matters here. And because so much of the current price of marijuana is compensating people for their legal risk, inevitably, legal marijuana is just once you don't have to compensate someone for their legal risk, it is basically a weed, and so the price is going to drop a lot, and to some extent you offset that with taxes. But if the price drops sufficiently, for example, if you didn't tax at all, we came up with an estimate that the price could drop by 80%, which you may think that's wonderful news, but predictably, if the price drops 80%, you will see a dramatic increase in the amount of use. Now, you could say, well, so what? The fact that use goes up per se may not be the big issue. The fact that adolescent use goes up, I think, is probably politically the most important issue.
And now you're saying it's not an availability issue because we know the young people have it already, it's a price issue.
It's a price issue. And so, kids. I just think politically, if adult use goes up, I actually think the public might be quite tolerant of some
Right.
misuse.
Interesting to see in Uruguay, the information came out just in the past week that they were thinking about $1 a gram, which translates to $28 an ounce. Now that you see that, and trying to undercut the black market and all that, but it does present the risk, once again, that Rob is suggesting. Well, let me jump here for a second. Did you have anything in terms of the Washington state dynamic around the kids issue? Is that played out in a significant way, or?
Well, when the Children's Alliance endorsed the initiative, that was a big step forward.
Now I want to take on one of the challenging issues, and Rob and Graham and Neil, if you want to weigh in on this, or others. So this is the issue about the safer message, right? And the safer message has been the one that marijuana is safer than alcohol, right? And I think MPP or SAFER has been running provocative ads. They have in Colorado as well. And I think many of us instinctively feel that that's actually pretty true for most people, right? Now, but we've also been, some of us, skeptical, saying we don't see that the public responds to that on a polling level, right? When you ask, he doesn't pick it up. It's a more subtle issue. And also there's the fear that there's this 800-pound gorilla out there, the alcohol companies, beer, distilled liquors, which has been staying on the sidelines of the whole marijuana thing. And maybe figuring, let these well-intended folks legalize it, and then we'll swoop in and try to dominate the distribution and marketing of this thing, because we can, blow them away with our skills. But the risk that if they start to feel pissed off, they might come in with some serious bucks and really trip this up. I mean, we see what happens when you put an alcohol tax on the ballot, right? So, Rob, Mason Ferd, who's been a key leader for, and Mason and Steve Fox, who are leaders of SAFE, will be receiving an award tonight. Mason now working with NPP directly. Rob, what's your thoughts? Because, we're going to have more discussions about this. Tell us what you're thinking on it.
So, I was skeptical that the SAFER message should be used years ago, and so we ended up, the Marijuana Policy Project ended up funding this new group called SAFER in Denver for the purpose of seeing if we could use Denver and Colorado as a petri dish to see if we could move the public opinion numbers forward on legalization. As it turns out, the first experiment was a local initiative in Denver in 2005, which passed by 54 or 55%, which took us by surprise. And then it went on from there, and then we all know what happened a year ago with 55% voting statewide, which all of us did not predict we were going to get that many votes. So our petri dish has shown so far that the SAFER messaging seems to have moved the public opinion numbers forward in Colorado at a faster rate than the national numbers. And these sort of prove that case. However, there might be other variables in Colorado. For example, is the well-regulated medical marijuana industry more responsible for the poll numbers going up than the SAFER message? We could have that debate. But so far, in my view, I think the SAFER message is, in fact, quite helpful in moving legalization forward. Looking at the alternative, if you look at the polling, most polls show that about a third of voters think that marijuana is safer than alcohol. About a third think that alcohol is bizarrely safer than marijuana. And about a third say it's about even. That means about 2/3 of the American people don't actually understand correctly that marijuana is safer than alcohol. So when you have 2/3 of the American people walking around with scientific information that's actually incorrect, in a way that's biased against us, that makes me quite nervous. And I think it's one of those incorrect beliefs that we have an obligation to correct as a movement. It's not the only message. Safer is not the only message. It's one of 4 or 5 messages, but I think it is a message that should be used. Now, in terms of the backlash, it is possible that we could all agree that the safer message is good and then still not use it if we're threatened sufficiently by the alcohol industry. So unfortunately, I'm spending an overly large minority of my time recently getting lobbied by the alcohol industry to stop using our message and to use different messages. And they even are starting to write ads for us on ads that they think are acceptable. So I'm getting lobbied pretty hard right now, and I want to just point out, for those of you who are not experts in the alcohol industry, there's really 3 tiers. There's the manufacturers, there's the distributors / wholesalers, and then there's the retailers. So it's the first tier, the distillers and the breweries. Those people are getting concerned, and those are the people who are, by and large, doing the lobbying on this. The third tier is starting to get a little interested. The retailers are starting to get a little interested. The second tier, the wholesalers, objectively, they should actually be giving us money to legalize marijuana, because we could write that second tier into our initiatives. We can say marijuana must be transported from point A to point C through a distributor that looks similarly to his alcohol distributors, and then they make a ton of money. So my concluding point here is, first, the alcohol industry is not monolithic, and while one tier might be angry, another tier might give us money. And then secondly, we are open to curbing the message if someone with authority actually puts a gun to our head. But it has to be a real gun. Right now I've only heard rumors of BB guns and slingshots. So I'm actually trying to find out what's real here and what kind of ads are they going to run. And there are ways they could screw it up too. The alcohol industry could actually run ads that are helping us, because some people in the alcohol industry actually think that alcohol is safer. And so if they actually run an ad that says alcohol is safer than marijuana, then we just get into the news some more. So there's a danger on their side.
Neil, you got your gun?
I'll not comment on that one. It's a little touchy topic these days. So. Anyway, as far as a safer message, I think this is a time for me to just make a comment about, staying in your lane. There's, for instance, for MPP, that's a very good point to make and message to carry, and as you can see, he's been very strategic in how to carry that message. He's done very good research on that. For us, for our organization, for LEAP, it's not about whether marijuana is safer, it's not about the properties of marijuana, it's strictly about the policy. And that's where we stay. We focus on the policy of prohibition, for marijuana. Of course, everybody knows our ultimate goal is all drugs, but for this issue right here, and where we have the momentum, and where we need to focus right now, it's on the policy. We're arresting over 700,000 people every year, which of course is a bad policy. It diverts law enforcement from paying attention to crimes of violence. We're neglecting issues of domestic violence and rape. We're not handling those cases properly. We're not putting in the time. We're not searching for missing children. We know how many missing children there are in this country. Crimes against our children, pedophiles, and so on. So that's where we focus, on where law enforcement should be aiming and targeting its limited resources. So for us, for law enforcement against prohibition, we don't talk about the safer message because that's not where our expertise is. And so we stay within our lane. And I think by having these different messages coming from different places of expertise, I think that's what's going to be critical in this. The many organizations that are now involved in moving this issue, we all have our own perspectives, we all have our own areas of expertise, and I think it's important that we stay, for the most part, in those lanes and on that track. And when the time comes, we have to be strategic about this. And that's the importance of all of us talking together and working together on the overall mission and effort so that we can be strategic and getting this thing done.
Before I pose back to Graham for a response on this, Ron, just want to clarify, my understanding of the literature is that when you look at the issues of complementarity or substitutability between marijuana and alcohol, there's no obvious conclusion on that. Is that basically right?
Yeah, so what Ethan's referring to, economists will try to figure out whether two goods complement each other, meaning the more of one you use, the more the other you use, or they're substitutes. And so a big public policy question is whether if you legalize marijuana, if it's a substitution relationship, you would actually see decreases in alcohol use, which I think most public health experts would say would be a positive thing. I think that would be a good trade. There are a handful of, and there are some studies that suggest a substitution relationship, but one of my favorite examples of sort of unintended consequences was so when the drinking age, federal drinking age, was enforced, alcohol consumption between the ages of 18 and 21 went down, as you would expect, but marijuana use went up, and that it's very plausible that what was happening there was this people wanting recreate, and they're choosing at the margin which one to use. There are a couple of studies that claim to show a complementarity. It's a very, and so experts can't agree on this. It's a very tricky issue though, because a lot of the correlates of both marijuana and alcohol use are things like certain age ranges, not being single. There are a lot of correlates that are shared by them. So it's very hard to tease apart, but it is a key question. And it's very tempting to argue that legalization could actually reduce alcohol problems. It's very tempting to argue, but we just don't know.
Yeah.
But quick comment, on that substitution theory thing there, there's another safer from a law enforcement perspective. Any street cop will tell you that. You know what? If we can substitute marijuana for alcohol, I'm for it. Because when we go to domestic violence issues, when every time you turn around there's a fight, alcohol is the issue. Alcohol is the problem. Encountering and unfortunately, back in the day, arresting somebody for marijuana possession. You don't want to ride. We didn't have paddy wagons. We didn't have cages in the back. The guy sat right next to us. Girls sometimes, lady. But in the conversations that we would have with somebody who is using marijuana, it's quite pleasant. And then sometimes we would make a quick stop to McDonald's drive-thru. But much safer.
Harry Levine and his research on the NYPD and looking at why they're doing so many damn marijuana arrests, that was one of the factors. Who'd you want in the back of the car? A 78-year-old, had a little joint, or somebody about to puke in your back seat.
Absolutely.
Let me take it to you then on this issue of the messaging, and then just we're going to go from after this big question to talk about what's ahead on the next stage of ballot initiative legislation, and then I'm going to take a few questions. So if you do have any questions, try to work your way to either the first or second seat close to the aisle right here, and I'll come down and take a few questions in a moment. So, Graham.
Well, on the safer messaging, look, one thing that's incredibly important is what's true, which is that marijuana is safer than alcohol. So that's a great starting point. In terms of the opinion research, the other thing in favor of the safer messaging is there are a lot of different ways to sort of predict whether somebody's going to support legalization. How old they are, gender matters somewhat, whether they use marijuana matters. But the single most predictive factor for whether you will support legalization is if you believe that marijuana is safer than alcohol. So, if it were possible to convince everybody of the safer message, then we would have won, right? The problem, though, or the other hand of this issue, is that people's beliefs about marijuana are deeply based on personal experience or observations of people near them. So it's incredibly difficult, at least the way that I understand the research, to sort of communicate to people about marijuana and have them change their minds about it. So I think it would be important, so what you say about Colorado is a great example. It might be because of safer messaging that opinion has shifted. It might be because of the medical marijuana regulations. It might be because of other stuff. So it would be great to actually do a sort of controlled experiment where you found out whether that worked. The one thing I would really compliment the Colorado Amendment 64 campaign on is that the safer messaging was used very early in the campaign. And it may well have helped. I honestly don't know that we know. But what is clear is that the messaging that was used in the closing weeks of the campaign was the same messaging that was used in the Washington campaign, which is the same messaging I expect we'll see in the 2014 campaigns, which is largely about that regulation is a better way to control the harms or perceived harms of marijuana. It frees up enforcement resources for law enforcement, and it generates new tax revenue for things that we better spend it on, education and so forth. It takes the money out of the hands of criminals. Those messages work, and they're the ones we were all using. So in a lot of ways, I think that the debate about the safer messaging, it isn't really that much of a debate. The one issue that if I could convince Rob and Mason and Steve to shift a little bit is, when there is a politician who has a history in the alcohol industry, don't go after the politician for that, because I think it ends up making a blip in the public perception, but then it's a lot harder to work with that politician afterwards. So but you know, I think we agree on a lot. I think we agree on a whole lot, even though people may think we don't.
Let me just finish off this discussion by asking Pete. The safer messaging was much less present in Washington State, but you did making a liquor control board, which was it going to go out of business, but for marijuana? You know, Washington used to be a state alcohol monopoly system, right? It changed that. So did this marijuana alcohol issue play out at all in your state or in the election or since?
Not really. It was convenient for the Liquor Control Board. They suddenly had a new industry to replace the one they just lost. That's not entirely true. Alcohol sales were privatized by initiative a year earlier than, 2 years earlier actually, than 502. But it meant that they had a regulatory structure in place and a model that was relatively easy to transfer to the medical marijuana, recreational marijuana use. So we did downplay. I don't think that, I mean, you can certainly hear the refrain, marijuana is safer than alcohol, but you know, our focus was on access by children, impaired driving, freeing up law enforcement resources, everything you said, and taxing it.
Well, so let's go on that. So public opinion poll seems to be moving incredibly fast. Ballot initiative, that option exists in about half the states. We see legislators introducing, I mean, sometimes I flash back and think about 1996, when we legalized medical marijuana in California, Prop 215. And then between 1999 and 2000, did 6 more states: Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine, right? And those were the first 7 medical marijuana states. And we tend to think maybe will those be the first 7, give or take 1 or 2, when it comes to broader legalization. If you go back then, you saw that it took a while for state legislators to start introducing bills. But at some point, and it seems like with marijuana legalization, the legislators are a lot faster to the table this time. You saw Maine, some other Rhode Island, other states really popping up quite quickly. So let me start off by asking Graham. Graham, you, I, Rob, 3 key national players in this stuff. We were telling everybody just 9 months ago, wait till 2016. Wait till the presidential election year. We know more young people show up in the presidential election year. It's the California initiative in 2012, they're in 2010. We're going to have a better chance of winning. So hold your horses, etc. But we seem to be changing our minds at least a little bit. Say something about that?
I keep getting surprised. The first comment I made on this panel was about the shift of the 10 points in the last year. So a year ago, it was really easy to say to wait until 2016 in every single state. And understandably, activists in any given state are like, we can win now. Come on, we want to join Washington and Colorado. Let's go. And so hearing this from multiple states. And really, I just felt like the grumpy old man. I'm like, no, we gotta wait. Well, let's poll and find out. And so time after time, we've done polls in now multiple states that the results with a 2014 projected electorate, end up being much more favorably than I would have imagined. So Oregon is going to move forward in 2014, clearly. I was surprised by that. But it turns out, first of all, you've got the advantage of, for 2014, you have marriage equality and the governor and a senator all on the ballot. So there's going to be more of a sort of presidential type turnout, younger turnout in Oregon. But the main thing is the public is growing and growing and growing in support. You know, it is so true in so many states now that, I mean, honestly, I think you can look down the list of states that we were thinking about for 2016, and there's not a crazy argument to be made that you should do it in 2014 in terms of public opinion. So the conversation now is becoming more of one of logistics and funding and things other than is the public ready for it. And as I said at the beginning, I worry that if the public is ready in any given state for 2014, and something happens between 14 and 16 to kind of, I don't think it's going to crash. I mean, we've made too much progress. But if that lift that we've just experienced in the last year kind of tails off a little bit in the next couple of years, we may find ourselves in 2016 looking back saying, oh, we missed that wave. You know, we were riding it and we missed it. Right. On the other hand, maybe... that wave is going to build and build, and so, you know, if we go forward to 2014 and we narrowly miss, we lose a lot of momentum, and if we waited till 2016, we could have really just absolutely scored a string of victories. So I think we're in a moment right now where there's a lot of uncertainty. I think it's amazing how much this movement has matured, because the conversations between state level people and national people across the national conversation, I feel like the conversations are really good conversations of trying to figure out what makes sense here. Ultimately, what's going to happen? As I sit here right now, I know that Oregon and Alaska are going to go forward in 2014. And there's a lot of interesting conversation about other states, and I think we just have to be careful. We have to make good decisions. Let's be hopeful for something important, but let's not overreach and blow it.
Yeah. I mean, you see public opinion polls recently in Louisiana and Texas showing numbers over 50%. Polling in a range of states from Maine to New Mexico, et cetera, showing also high 50s. The California poll has caused a whole lot of people to say, maybe we got to take a quick look at California. You know, one of the problems, of course, it's almost the end of October 2013. We're literally less than 13 months away from the next major election. And in order to draft them well, get them approved, collect the signatures, raise the money, time is actually growing short in some ways. But Rob, let me give it to you. I mean, you know, Alaska is a complex one, right? Because of when you have to vote in the primary season. And so what's your thinking on Alaska right now? And also, what's your thoughts about this 2014, 2016, et cetera, choice?
So Alaska is an outlier because it's the only state that requires ballot initiatives to be on the primary ballot. And so therefore, it didn't really matter much whether we did the primary in 2014 or the primary in 2016. So we said, let's just do 2014 because it's at least a state where we think we could score a victory in 2014. So that's sort of a special case. In thinking about the other ballot initiative states, so in the map that I have, that I use when I'm doing fundraising for this national plan, yeah, there's Alaska, yeah, there's Oregon, and then there's 6 other states that are potentially in play based on polling and common sense. And those 6 states, I remember them all right now, are Maine, Massachusetts, Arizona, Nevada, California. Did I say Arizona yet? Yes. Montana, thank you. So Montana has the worst polling of those states, but still good enough for 2016 in my opinion. So if you do process of elimination, Montana the polling is so dicey, and in Maine the polling is so dicey that I think it would behoove us to actually wait on purpose for 2016 because we need the numbers to go up. In Massachusetts, if I remember correctly, I think it's too late to even do an initiative for 2014 at this point. So that's just a state law issue. That's not, as far as I recall, it's just a matter of how the laws work in Massachusetts for all initiatives. California could go either way. Arizona, yeah, you could do an initiative for 14, but it would be massively more expensive than if we wait for 2016 because you're cutting the signature drive by 2/3 in terms of the amount of time you have. So for Arizona, you'd want to wait just to save a ton of money. So this is kind of matrix that I have in my mind with multiple variables to consider when thinking about 14 versus 16, and I still remain heavily biased in favor of 2016 for some of the reasons I stated, plus the fact that when I've been talking with funders, I've been giving them a 4-year plan. If they give this much amount of money in 13, and then 14, and 15, and 16, we'll have enough money to do all these initiatives. But if I could go back to these funders and I say, oh, I was just kidding, we actually need all the money in the next 12 months, I'm not going to be able to raise as much money, and therefore we would have to start slicing a couple states off the pie.
I'm not a strategist, but I definitely understand the importance of strategy. And, you know, I think it's, we're all from many different states, and we all would like our states to go and whatever. But what you're hearing here is strategy. You know, and you know, if we have numbers, like for instance, in Oregon and Alaska, and we know we all have limited resources, and maybe to keep the momentum going, what Graham mentioned about momentum and the importance of momentum, it'd be really nice to have 1 or 2 great victories in 2014. And so if that's, you know, for instance, Oregon and Alaska, even though we think we can do other states, then maybe we, with a laser, we hit Oregon and we hit Alaska. You know, and save the rest for 2016. I'm just saying the importance of strategy, and that's kind of like what I'm hearing. So,
yeah, and just one other thing too, 2 other things that we have to mention. So I see a couple of my friends from Missouri in the room, and they're going to start throwing things if we don't point out that there is a lot of belief of the folks in Missouri that they are in striking range, and they're raising the money to do their own polling. And, you know, I'm going to go out and about to get surprised by another one. You know, it's like we have our list, we know what we know, we have our plans, and then something comes in from left field. It's like, holy cow, Missouri? You know, and they're saying 2014 is going to be about it, so we'll see what the poll says. The other thing I want to say is medical marijuana, not to lose sight of that, because there's some good folks from Arkansas who came very close to it. For the future there. There's a group of people in Florida who are really working very hard marijuana, which is a big lift. I mean, you got to get 60% of the vote in Florida. So there's, you know, we do have our strategies, and they're largely complementary and overlapping, but then there just keep being things that come in from left field that we didn't account for, and we've got to make sure that our plans are flexible enough that we seize the opportunities that actually do present themselves.
Yeah, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Travis Mao over here, because he's the one who turned me and Graham and Rob around in 2014. It turns around in Missouri as well. So, yeah. Travis, thank you. I don't know if we're going to have time, but there are at least 2 other issues I wanted to throw up there. One is the issue of the growing marijuana industry and the future of marijuana legalization. And the second is the one that Zeke alluded to, which is how the marijuana reform relates to broader drug policy reform. But I did promise to take at least a couple questions. So anybody here has got one? Yeah.
Okay, so I just kind of want to bring it back to the safer message. I'm an activist in Rhode Island, trying to sort of lead the grassroots. And so I do a lot of thinking about this issue. And I wonder if it's, you know, maybe we're thinking about it a little incorrectly. Maybe it's not whether it's a good or bad message, but whether it's the right message